Third part in our series that I've been doing. So the first one we were talking all about mostly vocabulary, so I called the language of disease. It was really just getting familiar with some of the terminology that you'll be introduced to if you're talking about diseases, reading about diseases, anything like that. Um, and then the second part, I was doing more turf central. So this was all about turf diseases, and that's because we get a lot of turf diseases and a lot of questions about them because people really care about their turf, which is okay. And so I focused mainly on turf. And then this time I'm going to focus on trees and woody ornamentals. Um, and Amy said bot rot. Yes, we will be getting to that. So trees and woody ornamentals. Originally, I was going to have this be two parts, the woodies, and then do more like herbaceous, annuals, vegetables. But as per usual, it was getting really long, and I like to talk about these stuff a lot. So I think we're just going to do just woodies today. So trees and woody ornamentals. All right, so here are the objectives. Boring, we're just going to go through the different main diseases. We're not going to cover all of them, not even close to all of them, but we'll cover the main ones. All right, so we're going to start this off being the easier ones to manage, getting all the way to the hard ones. So we're going to start with leaf spots and the simpler things, the things that are not as detrimental, things that we can treat. And then we'll slowly get into the stuff that is a lot harder to treat. So first we have leaf spots. And in general, when we're talking about woody plants, most leaf spots are caused by fungi. And again, there's exceptions, but when we think about leaf spots in general, there's fungi and then there's bacteria. So if we have like a tomato, you see leaf spots on the leaves, you might be like, I don't know if this is fungus or if this is bacteria. When it comes to woody plants or the plants that have, thicker leaves, thicker waxy cuticles, it's really hard for bacteria to kind of penetrate in them. So you find that the vast majority of the problems are going to be fungal related. And again, not always true, but if you have like a shrub or a tree and there's leaf spots of some sort, you're pretty good guess to say it's probably a fungal leaf spot, not a bacterial leaf spot. And I will mention this many times, but as per usual, if you have really bad leaf spotting problems, it's most likely due to overhead irrigation. Too much overhead irrigation. The leaves are staying wet for too long. And a pet peeve of mine, and I'm sure you guys have noticed this too, when you have landscape beds that are on the same irrigation schedule and or using the same irrigation as turf, this is a major, major problem. And that's one of the reasons why we get lots of leaf spots, because you have, like um, a rotary irrigation system that's spraying landscape beds. Um, and I'll discuss this a little bit later, but when you have, established shrubs or established trees, it needs very, very little irrigation. So only some irrigation if we're trying to get it through a drought. So like right now, you might want to turn on, your hopefully drip irrigation for your landscape beds, because we haven't gotten rain in a long time. But you do not need to water them to the same level and using the same sprinklers as your turf. So definitely keep them on different schedules and with different irrigations. That's will solve pretty much all the problems. Another important thing to remember, and this is true in, when we have leaf spotting pathogens or pathogens in the soil, there is hundreds of fungi that will cause leaf spots or other different types of diseases. But there's also like thousands of fungi that will colonize dead tissue. So that makes it really, really challenging when it comes to diagnosing certain things. So, and this is the case for all of them, it's if you have tissue that is 100% dead, it is impossible to figure out what caused the decline or the death of the tissue because after the tissue is dead, other fungi and will move in and they're really good at colonizing the dead tissue. So just keep that in mind that just because you have a leaf that has evidence of, fungi on it, it does not necessarily mean that that fungus is what caused the decline. And that brings me to the next point. Not every brown spot means a fungus is a problem. So if you have leaves that have necrotic areas on them, it does not necessarily mean that it was a fungal leaf spotting pathogen that caused that. There's a lot of different causes for leaves to be necrotic. So we can have cold damage, sunburn, heat damage. You can have spray damage. You can have insect feeding damage that results in more necrosis. You can have just mechanical damage. There's so much that can cause even just normal senescence. Some leaves drop in the winter and they become necrotic after they've moved out all the chlorophyll. So there's a lot of reasons why you might have leaves that are necrotic and or dying in some way, and it's not always a fungus that's causing it. And then proper practices, like everything, if you just have good airflow, make sure you have the right plant in the right place, and just good cultural conditions, that goes a really long way to actually helping these issues. And these are two examples of some leaf spots I've seen over the years. All right, and so this is, again, just hammering through the point that not all dead spots on leaves are fungal leaf spots, even if you see evidence of there being a fungus or a pathogen there. Consistency is really important. So if you have one leaf that you have fungal spots on it, but the other leaves are necrotic without fungal spots, then then you might want to question that. When I worked in a diagnostic clinic, a lot of times we would put 4 pieces of leaf tissue on a plate, and we would do 3 out of 4 had this on it. So that is one way to tell that there was more evidence of this fungus being the contributor cause. All right, and so now I'm going to go through some of the more common leaf spotting diseases. But just remember, when it comes to leaf spots, there's a lot of different ones, and they're managed very similarly depending on, regardless of which specific fungus caused the leaf spots. So only if there's a persistent problem do you really need to fully identify what specific fungus. All right, we're going to start with one of my favorites, and this is rust. I love rust because I just find it pretty. I love the color orange. That's my favorite color, orange. So I just love rust. So when it comes to rust, they are typically orange to brown. So the one we have up here is very bright orange. I'll show a different example later on that's more of a brown color. One thing that's really, not diagnostic, but if you see this, it's really indicative of rust, is you kind of see it exploding off of the leaf. And what you basically notice is it ruptures through the skin of the epidermis. So the skin of the plant ruptures and then it releases the spores that were developing underneath. And so sometimes people will show you leaves that are kind of rust colored. So they're kind of chlorotic and they think that's rust. But that's just the leaves becoming chlorotic. If you want to see rust, you want to see it exploding basically from the leaves. Rust fungi are biotrophs. So this is something I mentioned in the very first webinar, and it's not really important to know the term biotrophs, but what this means is rust, they extract their nutrients from living tissue, killing the tissue, causing leaf spots, and then eating the dead tissue. They extract nutrients from the living tissue, and so they don't usually create very distinctive leaf spots. And this is because they're not killing the tissue, at least not early on in the infection. They're a nutrient sink. So they're stealing nutrients, but keeping the plant alive. And then they're highly, highly host specific. So this is just a fun fact. Pretty much every plant has a rust that will infect it. And I just created this meme because I thought it was funny of Oprah being, you get a rust, you get a rust. All plants get rust. And again, very, very rarely is rust ever a major issue, but you will see it often, especially if you know what you're looking for. And then as a fun fact, rusts have one of the most complex life cycles of all fungi. Sometimes this involves up to 5 different spore stages, so they produce different types of spores that infect different plants, sometimes up to 2 different host plants. Very, very complicated, but most of them you will just see this stage, which is the red or the orange spores exploding from the leaves. That's what you mostly will see. All right, this is again, you don't have to know this. This is just explaining how very, very complicated the rust life cycle is, which makes it hard to manage. So if you're dealing with rust on a commercial scale, it's a really, really hard pathogen to treat. Thankfully, in like a landscape and a homeowner's scale, very rarely, almost never, a big problem that requires treatment. But most of the time, we're going to spend time here. So this is where most of our rust is. Here's some examples of rust I've seen over the years. So this is turf. So this is St. Augustine. There's rust on grass. I probably had this in my last presentation. And again, very pretty, just exploding. Here's another example. You don't see very necrotic spots because it's extracting nutrients from living tissue. So it'll slowly weaken the plant. But you don't see those necrotic leaf spots that you would see in other fungal pathogens. Here's an example of it under the microscope. If you guys know anything about me, you know I love looking at things under a microscope. And again, these are really pretty spores. I just love this color. For the longest time, I would tell people my favorite color is rust orange. And I would say that forever. And then a friend pulled me to the side and she was like, you have to stop saying that because people think you mean like rust, like a rusty bike or something like that. I'm like, no, that's not my favorite color. My favorite color is rust orange. Like this orange is just perfect. Here's another example on blueberry, and this is a case where there are some leaf spots. Some plants do have what it's called is a hypersensitive response, HR response. Basically, they detect the pathogen and they cause that tissue to die off. And so sometimes it works and it kills it like kind of locks in the pathogen and it kills it off. Other times it's not fast enough. Here's what it looks like underneath the leaf. Again, it's exploding out of the epidermis of the plant. And then the spore is under a tape mount. And then here's where I remind you that rust is really complicated. So it doesn't always have again, sometimes you have the life cycle that has the two different hosts with different spore types, and it can look like this. So these are technically two different rusts, but they're very closely related. And so this is what they look like on different hosts. So we have cedar apple rust, and then this is cedar hawthorn rust. Again, very closely related. So this just creates large galls. And again, it's not going to really harm the tree at all. But someone might look at this and be like, that's concerning. I need to bring this into the Master Gardener Clinic. So just be aware. And I wish, now that I'm thinking about it, I wish I added a picture of what it looks like when it germinates. It will have like orange horns come out that exude the spores. So this is more of a dormant stage. So yeah, rust can look very different, but most of the time it's going to be these orange spores. All right, and here's something that is not entirely relevant to the topic, but it's not relevant to the topic. And I have it here. This is a personal soapbox of mine. So one thing you will notice, if you're like me and you love to look at things under a microscope, you will notice that if you see rust, you almost always, and like 70% of the time at least, you find these little tiny fly larvae. And these are tiny. When I say tiny, you can't see them with your eyes. You can barely see them with a hand lens, only if you know what you're looking for. So if you see like a tiny spot like right here is what we're looking at right here. And there's fly larvae. And I used to see this a lot when I was working in a diagnostic clinic. And I never knew what they were. And I Googled it, had a hard time figuring out what they were. They're midge flies, so they're fly larvae that feed on rust. And this is less cool of an example, but sometimes they feed on that really bright red spores and they become bright red themselves or bright orange. And that's really fun to see. So again, it's just an example. This was one of the first instances of my love for the like microscopic world really came like smacked me in the face full force, was figuring out what these little fly larvae was. And so this is just a hidden passion of mine. I love it. And it's also just something that kind of sparks an interest in all of the diversity that we don't always know about. So when I think about this, and this actually I found at the Ag Museum. So the Ag Museum, they have like native clumping sunflowers. I forget the specific kind. And there's pollinators everywhere, and we're counting that as diversity. And then I just picked up one of these leaves and I noticed, hey, that looks like rust. And then I looked under it and you see the fly larva. And that's just, so I think about on the small scale, the diversity that we're missing when we see all of these stuff. Yes, Debbie. You can type or speak out if you have a question. Or maybe you raised your hand on accident. Okay, well, I'll keep tabs if you have a question, Debbie. So yeah, this is a soapbox. You all know that diversity is important in all this stuff, but a personal love of mine is this microscopic diversity we don't think about as often. Okay, so I'm gonna move to a different leaf spotting pathogen. And I point this one out as well because I see this everywhere, literally everywhere. If you're me and you're just walking, you see, I notice this all the time. And so a fun fact about Cercospora, and again, that's a specific fungus, and most species have a toxin called cercosporin, original. And that toxin basically they release it and it kind of goes out in front of the fungus and it kind of degrades tissue a little bit before the fungus gets there and eats it up. That's basically what it does. But it causes a lot of chlorotic spots. So if you see a woody ornamental, I see it a lot in these really waxy leaves, these leaves that are really hard for most fungi and almost impossible for bacteria to kind of get into. Cercospora gets in and does well. So this is on privet. You'll see this very frequently, or it's also ligustrum. And again, you have the leaf spots, and then outside of it, you have the chlorotic halo that's caused by that toxin. Here's a cool example from Pittosporum. And again, it causes this intense necrosis. And in this case, you don't even see any necrosis, which was weird. So the point of that being, not all cercosporas do this. Some of them don't have that chlorotic halo. And also and Cercospora is not the only one that causes these type of symptoms, but it's really common, especially on woodies. So it's a good way to just kind of identify. You can kind of get closer without actually knowing. And also Cercospora is really hard to culture. So if you're in your lab, it's really hard to culture this. So anthracnose. So anthracnose is another one that you will see often. You'll see talked about often. You might read about this if you're reading about diseases, which I do. So when we talk about anthracnose, anthracnose is more of the common term. It's a common name. There is a species or a genera of fungi called Calototricum that mostly causes anthracnose, and some people use them interchangeably. It mostly doesn't matter. You can kind of use them interchangeably. Sometimes because I like to nitpick, ecological is the fungus, anthracnose is the symptoms. Regardless, that's another soapbox. This is really common, but the hard thing about anthracnose is it's an opportunistic pathogen, which means it does not do well infecting really healthy, strong plants. So it really, once there's a stress signal, some stress effect on the plant, that's when you start to notice more of those anthracnose symptoms. The other really challenging thing about anthracnose is it's really good at colonizing necrotic tissue. So you will find it in any dead leaf tissue you find because it just moves in once the tissue is dead. So it's hard to determine whether it's the primary cause of disease or if it just came in secondarily. And so even in a diagnostic setting, we had a hard time with this. So again, consistency is important. When you look at this sample, you have some fungal spots here, you have them here, which is all caulitotrichum. So in this case, there's enough of them that we're like, yeah, this fungus is probably causing these leaf spots. It did not move in afterwards. Enough for us to have that hypothesis. If we really wanted to determine it, we would culture this out, get some healthy plants, and inoculate. That's what you really want to do, but we don't have time for that. And then as a fun fact, and again, I don't want to give too many fun facts because I don't want to go over time. But if you notice, a lot of fungal leaf spots have this like concentric rings, and like a circular pattern is because fungi grow radially, so they grow as like a circle, but the rings come as like a day-night cycle. So if these were grown in 100% light all the time, you will see you won't see those circles. But because in our lab we have an incubator that's 12 hours light, 12 hours darkness, you get these pretty distinctive rings, kind of like a tree, but rather than by the season, it's day night. So that's just a fun fact. And then under a microscope, this is what you're going to see. This is under a compound light microscope. They look like sea urchins. And this is, a fancy fungal structure called an acerbuli that produces the spores. But in reality, you just have these hairy, seedy. Some people say they look like eyelashes. I think they look like sea urchins. Not many things do this except for anthracnose. And to answer Kathy's question, yes, you can see them under a dissecting microscope. So this was taken just from a camera. This is under a light microscope, but you will be able to see these black hair-like seedy pointing out under a dissecting microscope. But of course, the problem is figuring out if this is primary or secondary, because it is very often a secondary pathogen. It moved in after the tissue was dead. So that's the struggle with caulitotrichum or anthracnose, whichever one you want to say. All right, so I don't have much to say about Entomosporium leaf spot. Just, you'll see this everywhere. It's on Indian hawthorn. So as like a pathogen, it's not very common. The only time I've ever heard of Entomosporium was on Indian hawthorn. I've never heard it on anything else. But what I will say is it has very, very cool spores. So if you see here, this is them under, again, a light microscope. So they have like these like circular, and then they have like a little globo thing attached to them. And then they have this little hair-like thing, which they don't move. So it's not like a flagella or something. It's just interesting. It's just interesting spores. So I thought I'd point that out. You'll see Entomosporium a lot on Indian hawthorn, and then pretty much nothing else. All right, so let's summarize leaf spots. The good news is, if you care a lot about having or not having leaf spots, fungicides are relatively effective when controlling them. So we'll get into this a lot when it comes to the soil-borne fungus problems we have. Fungicides are not really effective. But with leaf spots, you can apply a fungicide and it will protect the leaves. But I repeat, it will protect the leaves. It cannot heal the leaves. Like our skin, if we get a wound, we can heal the wound. Leaves are not the same way. If they have a leaf spot, that leaf will always have that leaf spot. You can just hope to protect the future leaves. So that's an important thing to note. So that's why we want to catch things early. We want to apply things preventatively. But it's also just important to note that most leaf spots aren't a problem. And if you're having a problem with leaf spots, it's probably due to overhead irrigation or some other environmental or cultural factor that you're doing. So most of the time we don't need fungicides when we have leaf spots. They're very hard to use. So they're hard for homeowners especially to use. They're hard for landscape professionals to use because we have to use them preventatively, and people don't understand that. So if someone wants to get rid of their leaf spots, you can recommend fungicides, but the reality is unless they're trained, they probably won't know how to use those fungicides effectively, and it's just a waste of chemicals. So fungicides are effective, but fungicides are not insecticides. They're harder to use. And I've spoke about this before, and I think I have another slide. But when people think about pesticides in general, they think about insecticides. And with insecticides, you spray an insect and the insect dies. And so they think that that relates to fungicides as well. So if you have a fungicide, you spray a fungus and the fungus dies. That is not the case with fungicides. With fungicides, you spray a plant and it protects it from the fungus infecting it. And sometimes it can weaken the fungus, but it's never going to kill it outright. And so that's an important distinction, because when we think about that, that changes our management. We're focusing on only protection rather than, with some insecticides, you can wipe out the population. We're not wiping out the population with fungicides. If anything, we minimize, we weaken it. So just an important thing to keep in the back of your mind. Oh, and then I also have another soapbox moment. There is a quote that I really like by Doug Tallamy. You may have heard it yourself. A plant that isn't being eaten by something isn't doing its job. And again, this is I've seen this referring to insects for butterflies. A lot of times people talk about pollinators. You like to have pollinator butterflies, but we also need to have host plants for the caterpillars. And that's really an important message, and it's a good starting message. But I like to go deeper and think even about leaf spots, about diseases, about pathogens, and how they have a role in the ecosystem. So kind of like with the rust and the rust midge, so the fly larva that eats the rust, and then potentially you could have a parasitoid that parasitizes the fly larva. So there's like a cascading diversity that we don't always think about. That I think about, and maybe you guys can start thinking about. And then again, I love asking ChatGPT to generate memes for me. So here's a meme. I'm not worried. It's just leaf spots. All right. I will take a second, see if we have any questions. If not, we're moving past leaf spots. These are the easy ones. It only gets harder from here. So we're going to start with canker diseases. And there are two main groups of fungi that cause canker diseases. What I will say is you won't, if you think that this is too much and you won't be able to remember them, just remember Bactrosphaeria. And even more so than that, most people don't call it Bactrosphaeria because that's hard to remember. They just call it bot. So BOT, bot. It's bot rot, bot canker, goes by a bunch of different names. So this is the most important one to remember. A little bit more niche is there's a different related fungi called Sphaeropsis. Again, really hard to say, it's Sphaeropsis. That also causes canker, galling, swelling, and witch's broom symptoms. So again, if that's too much, just remember bot. But they're closely related, and actually, if we're looking at the culture of them, so this is a culture, and what, like I mentioned before, we have 4 out of 4. 4 out of 4 of the same fungus, so that's most likely causing the disease. If we had different fungi on the different ones, then it might be more of a concern. Maybe it's something else. But when I look at this plate, I can't tell which one it is, if it's Sphaeropsis or if it's Bactrosphaeria. We determine it by the host and by the symptoms. So you might see that. You might be like, oh, I have holly and I think I have Bactrosphaeria on it, but I can't find any information on Bactrosphaeria. You might want to take a look at Sphaeropsis and you might find more information. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. So again, so we have canker pathogens. They are 2 of them that are closely related. There can be more, but those are the main ones. Very, very, very common in Florida. You will see them a lot. And so when we talk about them, a lot of times they cause cankers, which is like that depression. And really what happens is underneath the bark, the fungus is growing, it's feeding, and it causes underneath the bark to swell. And then the bark will crack open. And that is what causes that typical canker symptom, which I'll show you on the next slide. But it also sometimes just causes swelling, which is more of like a galling growth. Also, sometimes it causes shoot proliferation and witch's brooming symptoms, which is basically when instead of one bud, you have like 50 buds or, 15 buds all coming out of the same where there would be only one bud. So it kind of looks like a witch's broom. So one thing that has been determined is that very often triggered by drought. But the most important thing is it's usually after wet conditions follow a drought. And so this is something that you may notice, and I've noticed before, where you'll have a drought, like kind of like what we're going through right now. Plants get really stressed from that drought conditions. And then all of a sudden you start to get rains. And then people might start seeing parts of their shrub or their hedge dying back, and they notice they have cankers. Um, and so they notice this and they're like, I don't understand. We're through the drought. Now we're finally getting rain and now my plant is dying. Sometimes that's because the drought stressed the plant. And then now that you have those wet conditions, like the rain, that's causing the fungus to proliferate. It also kind of triggers the fungus to reproduce and increase inoculum. So it sounds kind of counterintuitive. It's like, finally, I'm through the hard time and now my plant is dying. But that can be a reason. But drought is really often the initial trigger because it's the stress event. The second most important trigger is pruning wounds or other types of wounds. So this fungus only infects wounds. So it's not going to infect a perfectly healthy shrub. It's only going to infect a really stressed shrub that has some wounding somewhere. And this is not a soil-borne pathogen, which is good news. So that makes it a little bit easier to manage. It is a common misconception. A lot of people think that it lives in the soil. It survives in woody tissue. So if you have like dead, dead branches that are on the soil, it can survive there, but it does not survive in the soil. All right. So first I'm going to start with Pteropsis, which is the more unique one. It's a little bit more niche. Not everyone knows about it. So here is first an example on holly. And so if you see these galls right about here and here, this is caused by Pteropsis. We cut that up, we put it on plates, and we culture out pretty much this. I mean, this isn't this example, but this is what we would find. And that's how we know it's Pteropsis, because we see this. So we're like, it's either bot or Pteropsis. But then we see these symptoms because they're galls, we would consider it Spiropsis. This is a really unique situation on buttonwood. I've only seen it once, probably will never see it again. This is just the bark is it's swelling, the fungus has just gone crazy. And also Spiropsis was found. So this is really unique, but Spiropsis is just more weird, whereas bot is more like cankers. Here's witch's brooming. So again, and one thing with a lot of witch's brooming type symptoms, what people notice is just a bare patch in their hedge. And that's because when you have these bud proliferations, it's not going to produce normal leaves. So they'll notice more so bare patches rather than they actually notice this bud proliferation. All right. So here's Botrosphaerian again. Most people just call it bot. So this is if you moist chamber. So basically you put it in a moist chamber. The fungus starts to, grow and reproduce. So you see all that fluffy gray stuff that's on the first picture. That's the actual fungus growing out. This is a really diagnostic symptom of an early infection of bot. It starts with a very wedge shape distribution. So it starts off at the edge and then slowly starts to work its way to the center of the plant as it's killing it. This is more of a late stage symptom. The perfect wedge has kind of gone away and it's kind of blighting the entire branch. Now something I would mention for this is, in the case of this, it's, the plant's a goner. This is blueberry, I think. It's a goner. The bot has gone into the crown. And same thing with this. It's an early infection, but this is also the main stem, the main crown of, this is also a blueberry. It's very common on blueberries. We would get a lot of blueberry samples in. So a plant like this, It might live for a while longer, but it is infected in the main crown, so it is eventually going to take over the whole plant. Something like this, which is a branch, you can prune away, and I'll talk about this. And then Debbie asks, is this common on pink hibiscus? And if you're talking about bots, yes, it is common on pink hibiscus. It's common on most woodies, shrubby plants. And again, and I have another slide about management. Very, 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 very hard to manage. And really the best thing to do is just prevent. Also, a lot of times once you start getting older plants, so we notice this a lot in blueberries that are like past their prime. Just being an older plant is just a stress in and of itself. And, bot and other cankers are just a disease of really stressed out plants. So as they get older, they're more susceptible to bot as well. But managing stress is by far the best management. But first we'll say fungicides. Again, as I've mentioned before, and I will mention a million times, fungicides are not curative. If you have bots somewhere in the plant, no amount of fungicide will prevent the bots from being in that plant. It might slow the spread. It might, if you have like a very special plant, it might extend its life. It will decrease inoculum, so it might prevent it from spreading elsewhere, but it's not going to cure what's already infected. And you will see there's a lot of sources around that will recommend like a fungicide paint on pruning sites. And so to that, there's minimal evidence that that's actually effective. Some like orchards or commercial crops, you might want to apply a fungicide after you prune. But when we're talking about landscaping and other stuff like that, it has not been proven to be effective enough to justify it. So in reality, if you are pruning something, you don't really have to apply a fungicide after you prune or a fungicide paint to the pruning site. You can if you want. It's not going to hurt anything. It's just probably not effective. More importantly is sanitizing. So sanitizing your pruning equipment. So that's the most thing. A 70% isopropyl alcohol is what I would recommend the most because it's not corrosive. Bleach works, but then it's corrosive and so it might cause your pruning shears to be rusty. See this at branch tips. These pink hibiscus are trained as trees, not systemic. So it is locally systemic. It will spread, but it's not going to go throughout the entire plant. So again, if you see this at branch tips, most likely it's from a pruning injury that the fungus invaded in. But if you prune below that branch tip, below the symptoms, and you make sure you have sanitized pruning equipment, that will prevent it from spreading. So it's not going to spread further. So it's not like you get it in the tips and it's going to immediately go to the crown. Maybe you get it in the tips and it also infects the crown in a different area. That's a possibility. But most of the time you'll see it in one part of the plant and it's localized because that was either where the initial wounding was, or maybe that's where most of the stress was located. So it's not, so if you have it in an outer branch, you do not need to get rid of the whole plant. If you have it in the crown or in one of the main branches, most likely you're just going to have to get rid of the whole plant. Because even though it may take some time, it's going to eventually, stress the plant further, maybe cause it to be more susceptible to other things. So yes, I hope that answered the question. So a plant has mealybugs at the tips first, and then the canker-like growth. Very likely, the mealybugs damaged and stressed the plant and made it more susceptible to the canker. So again, pruning it out is the best management, and then minimizing stress in any other way. But because it's at the tips, it's salvageable. All right, so I think that's all I wanted to mention. Oh, one thing I will say is with these, because they are not soil borne, if you have a plant that got canker in the main stem, you need to remove it. You can plant that same plant. So this is not the case for other stuff we're going to be talking about. But if you have a podocarpus that is dying from bot canker, and you rip it out, you can put another podocarpus in there, and you don't have to worry about it infecting it through the soil. With a caveat that you have to remedy what made the plant originally susceptible to the bot canker in the first place. So you can't just plant you can't just plant a podocarpus in the same spot and, not, manage the, dirty equipment or the drought stress or other stuff like that. So just keep that in mind. And I feel like I have that somewhere else in the slides. All right. So we're going to move on to root rots and butt rots. All right. So root rots, butt rots, they're all soil borne. So the fungus is living inside the soil. They also affect the lower part. So roots are just the roots, butt is usually just the part of the crown of the stem, or the part that's, interfacing with the soil. It's called both depending on what specific plant or disease we're talking about. And the purpose of this slide really is just to kind of explain why fungicides aren't super effective when it comes to soil-borne fungi. And there's a lot of reasons for this. First of all, the soil is just so complex. It is so deep. I mean, the soil, this is just an example from land judging, this different layers of the soil. Fungi can live pretty deeply. I mean, most of it is going to be around here, but they'll have survival structures that go down pretty deep. This is true for other, micro and macro fauna in the soil. If you apply a fungicide up here, there's no way you can reach everything that's down here. And fungi are pretty much microscopic. They can start a new colony from a hyphal fragment, or a spore, a single microscopic spore. So that's why, with all of the technology advances we have these days, we still can't really control them effectively with fungicides. We do have fumigants, and fumigants do work, but even with fumigants, if you have like a strawberry crop or vegetable crop, they fumigate the field every single year, every season, they fumigate. Because even the fumigants that are applied through air, so they get through all the pores, they can't get everything, and the populations will keep growing. So this is just trying to help everyone understand why some people might come in and be like, I really want to apply, or I have this, and why can't I just apply a fungicide and solve the problem? Unfortunately, that's just not the case. Does frequent hedging make shrubs more susceptible to canker? 120%. So yes, frequent and improper hedging is one of the main reasons why a lot of shrubs get canker. It stresses the plant out, which is, and it is an inherent stressor that does not have to cause canker, but if you add that stress to other stresses, it's going to make them more susceptible. It reduces, some of their photosynthesis. So that's a stress, like a nutrient stress for a short period of time before they regrow those leaves. It opens up a lot of wounds. And in general, sometimes you have plants that aren't meant to be really small hedges. And so it's an added stress. They're not allowed to grow to the full potential that they were meant to be. So when it comes to hedges, there's some plants that are better hedges than others. You can try to make anything a hedge. Some of them just won't work because it's too stressful for them. But yes, hedging is very, 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 very linked to canker. All right. So now getting into, these are root rots. We're going to start with Phytophthora and Pythium. And if you watch any of my other lectures, you know that these are not true fungi. They are oomycetes, which is more closely related to algae than to fungi, where fungi are more closely related to like insects or us. But they have evolved convergently to do very similar symptoms. The big difference is oomycetes very much so thrive in wet conditions. You know, all fungi kind of like wet conditions, they need that. Um, but oomycetes even more so. They really like the wet conditions. So if you have an issue with Pythium and Phytophthora, it's most likely due to drainage issues or overwatering issues. What I will say is when it comes to Pythium in general, it's a very, very weak pathogen, meaning it does not infect healthy plants. Healthy plants, like Pythium is everywhere in the soil. Healthy plants will fight it off with no problem. It affects mostly young plants and also more herbaceous plants, so like annuals, stuff like that. So you will not find Pythium in woodies, especially older woodies. So like maybe in a nursery setting, if you're propagating, you'll find Pythium. In a landscape setting, you won't. And I wasn't even going to include Pythium and Phytophthora because it's not as common. But there are some Phytophthora species that can cause disease in woody plants. And this is an example on boxwood. And one thing that I like to point out with this picture is when you have diseases, a lot of times certain species are more susceptible than others. So in this case, we have a perfectly healthy podocarpus hedge, and then we have these boxwoods that are infected with Phytophthora. So that's a clear sign that there might be a disease issue going on because one is susceptible and the other isn't. If it was an abiotic issue, most likely you would have both of these would have, symptoms. Um, and then I also included something here about Phytophthora ramorum. You may have heard about this before. It's a regulated pathogen. We don't really have it in Florida. We have had some detections in nurseries, but it is regulated, so there's a lot of phytosanitary testing that has to go into nurseries that transport woody ornamentals, across state lines. It causes sudden oak death. So it's a really bad pathogen, but it's not one that we really have in Florida, so you don't have to really keep an eye out for it. But it's helpful to know, you'll probably hear about it maybe. All right, so armillaria. So this is another root rotting, sometimes butt rotting pathogen. And I say pathogen loosely because it is the vast majority of species you will find of armillaria are gonna just be naturally living in the soil and decaying already dead woody material. So it's a really essential component into a lot of forest ecosystems because of how it degrades, woody material. There are a few species or a few cases where it becomes pathogenic, where it can kill a living tree or a living shrub or something like that. But what I will say is it is more of those weaker, more opportunistic pathogens. So this is another one where you're gonna have to have a very stressed out plant in order for armillaria to, take it down. And a lot of times it's that last straw. It gets blamed for a lot of things. But it's usually the plant or the tree or whatever was on its way out. It was really stressed, and armillaria came in and just dealt that final blow. Um, but it can infect healthy tissue, healthy plants. So there are cases where, um, especially once it kind of just gets pathogenic, there are cases where it will take out a seemingly healthy tree, but a lot of times there's some underlying stress factor. It causes root decay, crown dieback, reduced vigor, and plant death. One thing I will mention is when it comes to some of these tree diseases in particular, it does cause plant death, but this may take some time. So that can be a little misconception too. Um, we would occasionally get samples in the diagnostic clinic up in Gainesville. We would tell someone, hey, this has, armillaria or Ganoderma, which I'll talk about. And they'll be like, it's, basically a death sentence. There's nothing we can do. It's also living in the soil, so we can't get it out of the soil. And then like a couple months later, they'll be like, hey, my tree is still alive. I mean, it's not looking good, but it's still alive. And so that is just important to remember that trees' lifespan is very different from ours. So some of these, especially when we have the armillaria and the Ganoderma, which I'll talk about next, the timeline between infection and death is long. It can be very long. So it's not always a fast process. Sometimes it appears fast because you notice the symptoms and then it's dead, but usually the infection itself was happening over years, especially in those older trees. So that's just something to keep in mind, I think. It spreads through root-to-root contact and rhizomorphs. I'll show a picture of them. They look like roots, but it's just thick clumps of hyphae that is, all clumped together so that you can actually see them with your eye. And they kind of are moved through the soil. So it's kind of like the mycelium, but it's thicker, tougher ones that move from tree to tree pretty much. One really diagnostic symptom is the mycelial fans or the hyphal fans. It's called both. So if you peel off the bark, you'll see these fans. So this is all hyphae, mycelium, and it just fans out growth underneath the bark. And so a lot of times it's easier to remove the bark than if it was a healthy tree or shrub. And you see that white fungal growth underneath. Here's another example of a moist chamber. So again, a big thing that we do in the lab is we will take out, we will just put the tissue in with some water and then the fungus just blooms and it goes crazy because it got all that water. So again, once established, armillaria will be in the soil for, let's just say forever, pretty much. And when it comes to eradication, people might want to eradicate it. There's really no way. The best case scenario, if you really want to plant something more herbaceous. Armillaria really, really prefers woody plants. And also just make sure you have the healthiest plants possible. As soon as they get stressed, they start to be more susceptible. If you want to manage it, the best thing is to remove the stump and all roots that you can. Again, if you plant new stuff, make sure they're as healthy as possible and don't give the fungus an entry site. But that's easier said than done, obviously. And then again, plant healthy as possible. No fungicides are going to cure it. If anything, you will prolong the life. But again, it's, with the tree's lifespan, it's going to continue to work. Maybe it'll take a couple years. So maybe that's worth it for you. I don't know. You can try soil fumigation if you care about spending that much money for something that may work and may not work. So that's something. And yeah, healthy plants. Here's some more examples of the mycelial fans. So if you just remove the bark, this one is a little bit deeper, but you can see those fans underneath. Here are some of the rhizomorphs and the mushrooms that you will see. You'll see these mushrooms everywhere, but most of the time they're just on decaying, already dead tissue, already dead like trees in the forest. And again, a lot of times they come in after the tree is stressed and is, about to die anyway. A lot of times it deals the final blow and then it gets blamed for everything. All right, so now we're going to talk about Ganoderma, and this is the last main one I'm going to talk about. Very, very common on palms. It's a big concern because people don't like to hear that once they have Ganoderma, they can't plant another palm. So again, there's a lot of different species of Ganoderma. Most of them are just decaying, already dead material. There is one species that affects palms that will kill living palm trees, and that is Ganoderma zonatum. There's also a similar species, kind of equivalent on oaks, less well known. And these ones are stronger pathogens. So with the armillaria, it's really secondary. It comes in when the plant's stressed. Ganoderma is a little bit stronger of a pathogen, meaning the palm doesn't have to be too stressed for Ganoderma to take over and kill it, which makes it really bad if you do end up having Ganoderma. So the big diagnostic feature is this hard shelf-like conch, which is like a mushroom that grows on the base of the tree, and it kind of just becomes like a shelf. Typically by the base of the tree. So or base of the trunk, sometimes people will send pictures of like a palm that has a mushroom like way up in the crown. And I'm like, that's probably not Ganoderma. Ganoderma stays close to the base. It's not usually spread by air contact. So there are spores, it produces spores. Those spores can infect new areas, but very rarely. Most of the time, it's moving slowly through the soil. So if you have one area that has Ganoderma, a neighboring area may well be okay. You have to worry less about the spores, although I would get rid of the mushrooms as soon as you see them to prevent spore spread. But the majority of the way that they spread is through the soil. So it's going to keep spreading, but slowly through the soil over time. Enters wounds like most things, but again, it's a little bit stronger of a pathogen, so it doesn't take much stress for it to start to infect. And if a conch is present, we remove the palm as much as the root system as we can, and we just don't plant another palm in that area. You may hear some people say after 10 years you're okay, after 20 years you're okay. The reality is palms are expensive, and I don't know who would take that risk. So here's up close, and again, I like looking at things up close. So Ganoderma has pores on the underside. A lot of fungi have those gills, but Ganoderma has pores. You also have a lot of really, again, really pretty orange spores that are tiny, tiny, tiny spores. And this is under a tape mount, and this is at 400x. A lot of the other stuff I showed on a tape mount was like 100 to 200x. So they look kind of like they look like rust, but they are much, much, much smaller than rust. They're also double walled. So it's hard to tell, but you can see there's two cell walls. There's like a wall within a wall. And that's really diagnostic of Ganoderma. So like if I get a conch and there's spores present, I can 100% confirm if it's Ganoderma or not. If there's not spores present, I can usually tell the feel of what Ganoderma looks like versus not, but I'm not as confident. All right, so this is just to reiterate that when it comes to these soil-borne diseases, there's no cure. Once it's infected, if you have if you have like Ganoderma or armillaria, you have to get rid of the plants. You're not going to save it. You can prolong it, and sometimes it takes a while for it to die, but it will eventually die. And that's really not what people want to hear. And also, that's not what we want to tell people. I still struggle with how to effectively communicate to people that, especially if they have a certain plant that they're attached to, and tell them like, hey, there really is no hope for this. That's not an easy thing to do, but that's the reality that we're in. So as far as advice I have, that's what we have to just deal with. We have to, sometimes have the hard conversations. But again, prevention, sanitation, and just proper plant health is what we need to focus on. And I mentioned this in my last slide, and I also mentioned this earlier on. Fungicides, they do not kill fungi, they protect the plants. So I think about it as an umbrella. So you have the rain. So if it's raining, the rain is the fungus. You open up the umbrella, and the umbrella, whatever is below it, will be protected from the fungus, which is the rain. So that's kind of a way to think about fungicides rather than they are killing or getting rid of the rain. We can't get rid of the rain. We can just protect the plants. All right, so I have 3 more slides, and these are just really quickies. I wanted to add and include them, but I have less to talk about. Phytoplasmas. So phytoplasmas, I've spoken about this before on my other webinars. They're really important with palms. So we have lethal bronzing, which I'm sure we're all aware about. Lethal bronzing is it's bad. It's spread by an insect. And again, once the palm is infected, we have to get rid of it. There's no cure. There's no way to protect, or there's ways to protect, but there's no way to cure. We also have citrus greening, which is not actually a phytoplasma. It's actually closely related to phytoplasmas, but basically they're bacteria that live only in the phloem of their host plants plus vectors. These ones affect the vascular system, so they're systemic. You get it in one area, and soon it's going to be spread to the whole plant. And just like the cankers, these are not soil-borne. So as I was mentioning with like Botryopsphera and other things like that, if you have a palm that gets infected with lethal bronzing, you can remove the palm and you can plant another palm in there. But again, the same caveat is you have to make sure you remedy the conditions that allowed the plant to be infected in the first place. And I also add Albert Einstein, the quote from him, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So if you have like for this palm is, on its way out, we can remove it. This palm we would want to test. It very well may have lethal bronzing as well. But it's not going to survive in the soil. It's not going to spread this way. It spreads through an insect that kind of goes around this way. So it spreads differently than what people may intuitively think it spreads. So if you want to plant another palm, consider doing insecticide applications, and also just monitoring, but also you might be in hot spots. Maybe you don't want to plant a palm. So just things to keep in mind. It's not soil borne. It will not survive in the soil. You remove this palm, and then it is gone. The disease is gone, but maybe the insect vector is still going to be around. All right, viruses, they're actually more common than you would think on woody ornamentals, but very, 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 very rarely ever a problem. You're never really going to see them become a problem. And also, even if you do have a virus, you can send it to a diagnostic lab and they may send you results being like, I don't know what this is. We would do that a lot because we only know very specific about certain viruses that are economically important. And so we have these ornamentals. There's a lot of viruses that infect ornamentals, but we don't know anything about them because it's not important enough for us to do research on them, unfortunately. So yeah, so with viruses, really don't have to worry about it. There's probably a lot of latent viruses in all of our plants, but we just don't know that much about them because they're hard to study. They're not as economically important, but they're still cool. And here's an example on blueberry. Blueberry does get some viruses and it's a woody. This is blueberry red ring spot virus. So it causes these red ring spots. But yeah, not a big concern, but just so you are aware. Nematodes, and this is another one. This is the last slide. And it is also, they're actually, again, like viruses, more common than you would think. They live in the soil, they exist in the soil, they are everywhere, they're ubiquitous. If we're in a landscape setting, it is very, very, very rarely going to be a problem. On citrus or other orchards or other commercial growth like that, you may have certain nematode species that might be a problem, but they're not going to be a problem in your landscape beds. And if they are, there's not much we can do about them because there's not a lot of nematicides to treat them. So the best thing is just resistant plant varieties if you can find them. And like everything else, just have healthy plants. The healthier the plant, the better the plant is suited for that condition and that environment, the less problems you are going to have. And if we have issues, root knot nematodes, sometimes this is an example of root knot nematodes. This is snapdragon, so it's an herbaceous plant. I didn't have any pictures that I've taken over the years of woody plants, but they do get root knot nematodes as well. But a lot of times they grow out of it or it doesn't impact them enough. All right, so here's a few relevant EDIS pubs where I found some of this information, although the vast, vast majority of it was just through my brain over the years. Right, so one more thing. If you want to submit a sample, we have different diagnostic labs throughout the state. We have the main one in Gainesville. And what I mentioned with the turf is if you have a turf or a palm problem, send it to the Gainesville lab. They have a turf specialist there. They also have the ability to do the palm test. So palm testing is really challenging because you have to do molecular stuff. You can't just put it on a plate and culture it out. So if you have a palm or a turf problem, go to the Gainesville campus. Anything else, you could do either one. So if you have an ornamental, a tree or a shrub or fruit or vegetable issue, you can send it to the diagnostic clinic at the Gulf Coast Research and Education Center. And that is that's in Waimama or Balm. And the benefit of this is you can drive and drop it off. So if you have a larger sample and you don't want to pay, shipping fees to send it to Gainesville, it's just like a 40-minute drive, drop it off at the one at the Gulf Coast Research and Education Center. And then also you have me. I have a lot of knowledge about diseases. I worked in this lab for 3 years and I worked here for a semester. So I'm also familiar with the people working there and the what tests they can and can't do. So yeah, no problem, just coming to me if you have questions. And then Amy asked, are there other bacterial infections besides phytoplasmas? Yes, but also no. There is definitely other bacterial infections that you can have, but they're a lot more limited. So it's, here and there, there's problems. So yes, just not enough that I felt the need to highlight any of them in this presentation. The only thing I can think of, there's some cankers, so like agrobacterium, and maybe I should have added that one. Agrobacterium gall, so the bacterial crown gall, that is something that's on woodies. Now that I think about that, that might have been important to add. Um, but like I mentioned, leaf spots, very few bacterial leaf spots. Um, like leaf rot, like plant rots, so like with herbaceous plants, you have like bacterial rotting pathogens. Very rarely are you going to have like bacterial rotting pathogens with woodies. There is Ralstonia. Um, so there's Ralstonia, which is on blueberries and it can be on other, and it's a bacteria that infects the vascular system. It can cause, decline. It's just not common on anything other than blueberries. It is a regulated pathogen though. So we have some endemic strains of Ralstonium and then some non-endemic strains that we do not want in the United States. So to answer that, yes, of course, there's 1,000,002 exceptions, but not common. All right. Finally, oh, I added this picture. This is something I saw this week, actually. And I just added it to the slide because I figure like if anyone is to understand me, it is you guys. I was walking the dogs and I saw this person doing a great job uh you irrigating their sidewalk, which I just thought was funny and I wanted to share because this is why we do what we do. We have to recognize that, how to educate the average public. But yes, this is really great. Just remember to water your driveway every now and again. And as usual, I have a survey. Uh, you guys are familiar with extension. Um, Surveys are important. It's been hammered into my brain. We do surveys, but also it's important for me because I'm new and I'm still learning how to effectively teach this material. I've been, immersed in this world for so long. But most of the people I talked to were other people that worked on plant diseases. So I'm still honing my craft. So constructive criticism, give me all of it. So fill out the survey, please. It also helps us know what's next. Um, of course, I have a couple other ideas. I would like to eventually do an in-person training. It would be really cool to do one where we go over some diagnostic techniques that we can do here. So some diagnostic techniques, it's best to just send it to the lab. If we want to culture it, just send it to the lab. But moist chambers are really something we can do here. Tape mounts where we look at things under a light microscope, something we can do here. Also just microscope help in general, something that we can work on. If you've been around the lab, you know that I've been obsessed with galls recently. I would love to do a presentation on like mites and or other galling insects. I've been really, really obsessed recently. But yeah, so if you have other ideas that you want me to talk about, nematodes, that's important too. So yeah, just fill out the form. And yes, the recordings are available. Can phytoplasmas be cultured? No, they cannot. So that is why when you see like the phytoplasma that cause lethal bronzing, it's Candidatus, Phytoplasma palmae, and then there's some numbers. And the Candidatus is because it cannot be cultured. And so same with citrus greening. If you look at the citrus greening pathogen, it's Candidatus, Libobacter, asiaticus, or something like that. And so the candidatus is for bacteria that we cannot culture, so we only know them based on like DNA. Um, and so that's just a fun fact that I love talking about. But no, they cannot be cultured because they can only survive in the host and in the vector. We have yet to find a way to have them survive outside, but I feel like I heard somewhere that there's progress in that department. Um, but yes, as of right now, we cannot culture them, which makes it really hard to study them. Good questions. Any other questions? I'll stay here as long as you want. I did better this time, still a little over time, but I was a little bit closer. I still need to work on my time management a little bit. Just sometimes I get talking about these and I just want to say everything.
We don't mind because it's great information.
Yeah.
Any questions? If you wanted us to ask, you can unmute yourself.
Also, you can always send me an email if you have questions later on or stop by my office. I actually walked in this morning and there was I just had a plant inside of a Publix bag on my door. And I was like, man, someone's just leaving plants at my door. I love it. It was from Michelle. But I was like, yeah, I'm just getting plants left. And that's great. Neem trees planted in landscape to deter insects. I've heard of that, but I don't know much about it. So I don't know how effective it is, but I have heard about people doing that. I can look into that, but I don't know any specific information. Interesting. A neem tree farm in Brandon. Or is that, yeah.
Yes, we went there for a field trip one.
What?
It was about quite a few years ago, but very interesting.
Man, sick invite. Just kidding. But I would like to go there too. That sounds cool. I find trees very fascinating. But they're just also really hard because of how slow growing they are. I recently learned, this is my first time learning about it, about different air pruning techniques at nurseries where you, rather than having them in the pot and they get root bound, you have the pot with holes so that once the roots touch the air, they naturally prune out that way. And it makes a more effective root system. So that was really cool. I just learned about that. A specific insect affecting night blooming jasmine shrubs. Not that I know of. I have yet to see insects on them, but I'm sure there is an insect that affects them. There's an insect that affects literally everything. But I've never seen specific examples of that. So far, there's time for everything. And thank you all as well for being here, and also being my guinea pigs to practice all this. Yes, when I used to, as much as I don't like being recorded, I also understand that when I was taking a lot of these classes where I learned this information, I had to rewatch it many times in order for any of it to just set in. So you're welcome. I will get past my fear of being recorded so you can rewatch it so you actually can remember some stuff.
With that,
yeah. I was just gonna say, if you guys want to leave, you can leave. I'll stay until everyone's gone, and then if you have any questions.
thanks everybody for attending. I know I've been enjoying these presentations and I've heard lots of great comments too. So thank you very much, Caitlin, for
You're welcome. Yeah,
putting your time
I
in.
I
helping out.
love doing it. And yeah, I have so many more ideas that we could do stuff on. I've been, again, going down that gall rabbit hole. I'm researching aerophyte mites on the weekends, just talking about how they produce galls. So I I love doing this. If you want to listen, I'm here to talk.
Oh, that's great. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the
Mhm.
recording.
All right.
And